Okay, hello everybody. Thank you for coming. We're going to get started. So Affan is here to present probing magnetic field properties in galaxy clusters. Also, please, we have tea and cookies available if you would like. So let's have a round of applause. Thank you very much.
Okay, well everyone, thanks a lot for having me. I'm going to be talking about the research I've been doing over the past couple of years, really, about cosmic magnetic fields. This project that I've most recently been working on has been concerned with galaxy clusters. And yeah, I'll just walk everyone through it. And if anyone has any questions in the middle, please stop me. Okay, so I'm open to questions in the middle. Okay, so let's start off with a brief introduction. So as astronomers, and more importantly as humans, we care about the universe and we want to know more about the universe. And 90% of the baryonic universe, which is the part of the universe that we can see and measure. So we know that the universe is composed of dark matter, dark energy, and baryons. And 90% of the baryonic part is magnetized ionized plasma. So, and we know that this magnetized ionized plasma is in the cosmic web. So over here I have a simulation of the cosmic web done by the illustrious TNG project. So essentially this maps out the gas in the universe, and these sort of lines here are filaments, and when these filaments connect at the densest parts of the cosmic web, galaxy clusters form. And galaxy clusters are essentially the largest self-gravitating objects in the universe, and yeah, they're pretty cool. So they're going to be studying galaxy clusters is probably the best way that we can know more about the magnetized ionized plasma that makes up the universe. All right, so let's get started. Okay, so to start off with, what is a galaxy cluster? Well, I was saying that it's the largest self-gravitating object in the universe, and well, it's just a mass of galaxies that are gravitationally bound to each other. So over here, I have a picture of the bullet cluster. And the reason why it's called the bullet cluster is because you can see clearly in this image, it's almost like there's a bullet going through some kind of fluid, and there's like an aftershock coming off of that. That's why it's called the bullet cluster. But turns out that most of the mass in galaxy clusters is not actually in the galaxies, but it's in the plasma that's between the galaxies. So over here in the bullet cluster, these bright points are galaxies, and this diffuse medium that you can see is the plasma that's between the galaxies. That medium is called the intracluster medium. And this medium is also magnetized and ionized. So essentially, we want to study this medium to know more about the properties of the galaxy cluster, to know more about how certain events lead to magnetization of the medium. So essentially, we think that during the formation of the galaxy cluster, there was some seed random magnetic field that wasn't very strong, but due to stuff like turbulence and shock waves, this magnetic field gets amplified and gets stronger. So this project was mainly to study that magnetic field. All right. Okay. So before I mention how we can actually study the magnetic field, I'm going to do a brief introduction to quantum mechanics because it's kind of important for this purpose. Has everyone taken like an introductory quantum course? Okay, some yeses, some no's. Okay, so essentially in quantum mechanics, everything is written as a state, some state psi. And we know that polarized light, and polarized light basically means that light is a transverse wave. So this is E, and this is, and it's composed of an electric and a magnetic counterpart. So polarized light essentially means what angle this electric field makes with the path of the light. So this would be like sort of vertical polarization, and then this image over here is circular polarization. So you can see that the E field actually circulates as the light propagates. So essentially that's polarization. Now we can decompose any any polarized light into a bunch of different polarizations. So the most common are, well, the most common sort of base states are linear polarization. So maybe, so this is a horizontal and a vertical polarization. But for our purposes, what we're going to be interested with is right circularly polarized and left circularly polarized light. So essentially, what happens is, as the light propagates, the E field oscillates around the light. So it goes in a circle, sort of a helix, mapping it out. And as this light passes through an ionized plasma, what happens is the E field causes the electrons to rotate as well. So the electrons in the plasma are caused to rotate by this E field. And when that happens, the electrons produce their own magnetic field. Okay, so essentially, that's the process that we're going to be looking at. Maybe I should have backtracked a little bit. Yeah, so polarized light can be split into left and right circularly polarized, and the left circularly polarized light is going to produce a different sort of magnetic field, so it might get magnetically enhanced, and the right circularly polarized light is going to produce a different magnetic field, so it might get magnetically unenhanced. I don't know what the word is, but it's going to decay or something. So there's going to be a shift in the angle of polarization as the light propagates through the plasma. Was that clear? Okay, yeah, let me repeat myself. Okay, so the entire idea is there's some background source over here. Maybe it's a neutron star or something like that, okay? And this source is emitting linearly polarized light, okay? All right, and this linearly polarized light, you can decompose it into left circularly polarized and right circularly polarized. And each of these is gonna either undergo magnetic enhancement or it's gonna undergo magnetic decay. I don't really know what the term is, but this is gonna cause a shift in the polarization angle when you recompose it. So maybe you can think of this in terms of some operator acting on this ket, but it acts differently on LC and RC. And then when you're measuring the light over here, you're going to get a shift in the angle. So that's sort of, yep. That's a good question. We're exclusively going to be looking at polarized light for measuring magnetic fields. So yeah, I'm gonna talk more about that later as well. But so far, it's clear, right? This is sort of important. Okay. So essentially, we measure the polarization angle using the Stokes parameters. So the ones that we're concerned with are the Stokes Q and U parameters. Essentially, what this is you place a polarizing filter on your telescope, and then you measure what the horizontal and vertical intensity is, and then you place a 45-degree polarization filter, and then you measure those. And you can find the angle of polarization by the arctan of their ratios. Okay. So, all right. So what I was mentioning over here is essentially captured in this one image. So this is going to be how we're probing the magnetic fields. So there's this cluster that we're interested in, and we want to know about the B fields of the cluster. And there's a radio galaxy in the background that's emitting polarized light. So as the polarized light passes through the magnetized ionized plasma of the cluster, the magnetized ionized plasma is going to undergo rotation. So over here, the angle of rotation is like this, and you can see over here near the telescope, it kind of gets rotated. And the amount of this rotation is proportional to the line of sight integral of the B field. So if there's more rotation, we know that there's a stronger B field. If there's less rotation, we know that there's a weaker magnetic field, essentially. Okay, that makes sense? Okay, awesome. So we quantify how strong the magnetic fields are using this rotation measure. So essentially, we think that the observed polarization angle as a function of wavelength squared is a linear function. So that's the simplest case. And over here, I've plotted what that looks like. So essentially, this is wavelength squared on the x-axis, and on the y-axis is the observed polarization. So you can see that it's sort of a linear trend. But and then using the slope of this line, we can know the rotation measure. And by knowing the rotation measure, we know how strong the magnetic field is. This is the simplest case, but there's a lot more complicated cases that we've had to deal with in this project. All right. So the final goal of this project is to essentially model the magnetic field of galaxy clusters as a Gaussian random field. And well, what the hell does that mean? I'm going to explain all of that in a minute. So we're going to observe the magnetic field, and we want to simulate the magnetic field and compare our simulations with observations to improve our models. That's sort of the key point of any astronomy study that you do. So to explain what our model is going to look like, I'll just talk a little about probability theory. So over here, I've plotted a few Gaussian random fields. A Gaussian random field just means that you're drawing your samples from a Gaussian probability distribution. And there's different correlations. So for example, maybe there's no spatial correlation in your data. So that's what this would look like. If there's some correlation, you can see there's these sort of small bumps, small sort of clumps. Or if there's a little bigger correlation, you can see all of this structure forming. And this is like the most correlation. So astronomers, we measure the amount of correlation using the power spectrum. I'm not going to explain what that is, but if you really want to know, it's the Fourier transform of the correlation function. Okay, so essentially we know that magnetic fields can be modeled using a Kolmogorov power spectrum. This is a very special power spectrum that goes like negative 1.67. So over here, I have a simulated magnetic field from Seta et al. 2022. So this is sort of what we think galaxy cluster magnetic fields look like. And this has been confirmed through numerous observations and so on. Okay, so now back to this. So we're going to model the magnetic field as a Gaussian random field with a Kolmogorov power spectrum. And we think that the magnetic field is going to be proportional to the density of electrons in the galaxy cluster. So if there's more electrons, the magnetic field is probably going to be stronger. And we're going to compare the observations with our simulations. So over here, I have plots of the simulated rotation measure for one cluster, and I have the observed rotation measure from that same galaxy cluster over here. So I'm going to walk you through the method to actually do this. And to do that, let's take a look at where we get our data from. For this project, we're going to be using data from the Australian Square Kilometre Array Pathfinder Polarization Sky Survey of the universe's magnetism. It's a mouthful. It's a lot of words, but for short, ASCAP is the telescope, and POSSUM is this polarization survey that we're going to be using data from. And just a short sort of introduction to ASCAP. It's a precursor to the Square Kilometre Array, which is sort of this big radio telescope project that is being built right now. I don't know when it's going to be launched fully, but yeah, it's pretty cool. And the reason why we can do a better job is simply because we have a better telescope than previous studies. Our data density is like 70 radio sources per cluster compared to previous studies, which were limited to 10 radio sources per cluster. So that's why we know we're probably going to do a better job than previous people. Okay, now how do we actually go about selecting which galaxy clusters we want to look at? Because there's a lot, right? So there's a few constraints that we want to put. So the first constraint is there's actually one constraint, which is described by these two constraints. The one constraint we want it to be as big as possible on our telescope, right? And for something to be big, we need it to be close to us, and we need it to be big in size, actual size, right? So that's essentially the two constraints that we've put. And using these two constraints, we've narrowed down our first target. This is a fairly average size galaxy cluster, I would say. It's called Abell 3581. I won't go through all of this, but yeah, it's pretty close to us. And over here, I have an optical image of the cluster. So essentially, all of these points are galaxies in the cluster. For example, this one is a pretty cool one. I think it almost looks like a barred spiral galaxy that we're looking edge on, and the bright points is probably emission from the quasar at the center of the galaxy. Okay, is everything clear so far? Everyone following along? Awesome. Okay. So remember how I was saying that measuring the rotation measure isn't always that simple with that straight line that I had over here? A couple of slides back. Yeah, this one. Or no, that one, this one. Yeah. So this is the simplest case. Usually most cases aren't this simple. So we have to do a bit of math. Is everyone familiar with what a Fourier transform is, or the concept of it? Okay. So I'll quickly go through that. So essentially, remember how we measure the Stokes Q and U parameters? Those are the two parameters that we actually measure with a telescope. Then we can stick these two parameters and make a complex polarization vector out of this. So we do Q plus the imaginary number I times U. And essentially, a Fourier transform is this integral. So we're doing a Fourier transform from wavelength squared space to something called Faraday depth space. So Faraday depth space is technically the rotation measure space. So over here, I have a couple of plots. So for example, the first plot, you can see that there's this huge peak at 0, right? So wherever there's a peak, that's the sort of rotation measure we would measure with the line method. But it gets a little complicated. So that's the simplest case. In a more complicated case, turns out that you have two peaks, then you quite don't know which is the actual rotation measure, which actually tells me how strong the magnetic field is. Is it this peak or is it this peak? That's where we go into a few issues. Usually what people do is they take the highest peak to be the rotation measure. And we're going to try to also quantify how many peaks there are in this Faraday spectrum and so on. Okay, so that's the first method to essentially know the rotation measure. To calculate the rotation measure, this is the first method. Another method is to simply fit the Q and U parameters. So in the simplest case, we know that the Q and U parameters, they follow a sinusoidal sort of pattern. So this is the simplest case. You can see it's a clear sinusoid and everything's nice. But in a more complicated case, we have no clue what the heck's going on, right? So for that, we have like a bunch of models that I'm not really going to explain. But yeah. Okay, maybe I'm going to gloss over this as well. Yeah, this is essentially how we determine how good our fits are. But yeah, this isn't that important for now. And this essentially tells us, this plot essentially tells us how many peaks there are in that Faraday spectrum. How complex is the source? A simple source would have a straight line or a single peak. A complex source would have multiple peaks. So that's what this plot says. I'm not going to really talk too much about that. Okay, so now we have all of our rotation measures. We know, we've quantified how strong the magnetic fields are. But there's a lot of corrections that we need to make for our data because astronomy is sort of known to have bad data. And we're going to deal with that. So the first correction that we're going to make is we're going to throw out all the sources that are dominated by noise. So essentially sources that have a signal to noise ratio of less than 10, we're going to remove from our data set. And once we've done that, we're going to make another correction because remember how this is a line of sight integral. So everything that's in our line of sight is going to affect the rotation measure we observe. So the biggest thing that's in our line of sight is the Milky Way galaxy. So we need to correct for the galaxy's magnetic field. For doing that, there's this galactic rotation measure map by Hashimoto et al. 2022. And we just subtract that off from the rotation measure that we measure. So the blue points are the corrected rotation measures and the orange points are the uncorrected ones for the galactic magnetic field. But this map isn't that good, and I'm going to talk more about this later as well. I'm not going to really talk about this because too many technical details, I guess. Okay. So now we've done that. What's the next step? Well, we've corrected for the galaxy's contribution. Now we want to know which sources are actually behind the galaxy cluster. And the reason why is because we want the sources to actually probe the galaxy cluster. So sources that are in the cluster don't completely probe the entire cluster. So for example, maybe I should draw this over here. So for example, we are here with our telescope, and we're sort of looking at this galaxy cluster, and there's this source over here. As the light propagates through this source, it's going to probe the entirety of the cluster. But if I have a source that's over here, it's only going to probe this much of the cluster. So we're not going to get enough information. So that's why we look at sources behind the cluster. So that's what we're going to do first. So over here, I have a really pretty picture because astronomers like pretty pictures. And yeah, so essentially, this is a radio galaxy. In the green point over here is the optical source. So astronomers, we observe in different wavelengths. Optical is the light we can see. And in white, I have overplotted the radio sort of emission. So this galaxy emits radio jets, and presumably from a black hole, and the radio jets sort of get curved. So what I did was I went through all 80-ish sources manually, and I identified which sources actually are in the cluster and which sources aren't. That took a while, but finally I found that, yep.
Okay, so you have like this contour plot, right?
Yes.
So this is we're seeing what is like the contour axis like? What does the contours mean? What are those levels?
The contour levels are sort of the intensity in radio.
Okay, and so does this mean that like you have like little circles?
Mm-hmm.
Does this mean that in the side of a circle you have like you would expect to have a source of something, or?
Oh no, this is the single source, right? So this source is emitting all of this radio emission.
That's okay.
That single source is emitting all of this.
And so then why would you expect to have these like circles coming? Like why would you have? Because a circle I'd imagine means like you have like a kind of pulse almost, right?
Yes.
So and that's the jets because it's like
exactly
spinning or something.
Yeah.
Oh, okay. That makes
Yeah. And the contours over here, if you really want to know, is I'm plotting it at different levels. So this is like different noise levels. So this is like the 3 sigma contour, this is the 6 sigma contour, and this is the 12 sigma contour. So that's why there's multiple sort of circles. And finally, I found that there were only 2 sources in the cluster. The rest of the sources were actually behind the cluster. And once I did that, I wanted to make sure if I was actually correct. So I went through a bunch of literature to see if the redshift in the literature matches the redshift that I calculated. And turns out that it pretty much does. It's pretty good. Okay, so finally, this is what the magnetic field of this cluster looks like. The rotation measure is a proxy for the magnetic field, the line of sight magnetic field. Positive rotation measure means that the line of sight field is pointing towards us, and negative means away. So yeah, what is the next thing that I'm talking about? Okay, so we want to sort of quantify what this magnetic field is doing as a function of radius. So over here, that's what I've plotted, Rm as a function of radius. There's not much information in this plot, but there's a lot more information in this plot because over here I'm plotting the scatter in the magnetic field as in a moving bin. So I have a bin of say 5 points. I'm going to calculate the scatter over here, then I'm going to move the bin like this, calculate the scatter again, and so on until I cover the entirety of the cluster. And we get something that we don't really expect because you can see the scatter remains relatively flat and then sort of drops off suddenly. We would expect the magnetic field to drop off sort of like this, to drop off steadily. But we don't have that, which is sort of unexpected.
What is RM again?
RM is, you can think of it as a measure of the line of sight. Yeah.
So that's the
So
sigma RM is the
scatter. Yeah. So if I go back a bunch of slides. Okay. So this integral right here, without the lambda squared, is Rm. So it's a line of sight integral of the thermal electron density times the magnetic field, the parallel magnetic field. Okay. Okay, so that's that. Okay. So this is the distribution. Then I want to draw your attention to this plot, which was sort of the most interesting plot I have for this project. What we identified was there's a possible, not actually a possible, but yeah, there is a filament that's going through this galaxy cluster, a cosmic filament. So remember how I was talking about the cosmic web and how the filaments connect these galaxy clusters? This is a possible filament of this cosmic web, so that's pretty cool. So the first thing that we wanted to do was we wanted to check if this filament is actually sort of in the cluster or if it's just something we're seeing in the galaxy. And to do that, we looked at sort of dust maps, dust emission, and we don't see any structure that correlates with the position of this filament, so we likely think it is a cosmic filament. In this plot, you can see it more clearly because we took more galaxy clusters. So each of these circles is a galaxy cluster, and the red one is Abell 3581, which is the first one we looked at. You can sort of see that there's this cosmic filament that's connecting all of these galaxy clusters, which is pretty cool. Okay, so that's to do with the cosmic filament. And remember how I was saying that our galactic subtraction isn't that good? That's because of this map. This is what this map looks like over the entire sort of cluster. It's pretty much constant. So this map has a very poor resolution simply because it was constrained by not good enough data density. So we want to try to do a better job of correcting for this. So what we thought of doing was, well, we could just remove the filament part and we're left with this. We can assume that the data over here sort of looks like the galaxy's magnetic field because it's not on the filament. And then we can do an interpolation. All right. So this is the map that we produced of the galaxy's magnetic field on this cluster with an interpolation. This was part of my previous work, or used results from my previous work. Yeah. So far, any questions?
When you say filament, what do you mean?
Okay. I mean this. Okay, sorry. I mean this. This. So this is the cosmic web. There's these filaments that are connecting galaxy clusters. Okay. Okay. I don't really know how much time I have. Okay. So this is the. Okay. Okay. So this is the map that we produced, and actually this paper was just accepted for publication just today. It was kind of cool, but yep. Okay. So now we have the data, which looks something like this, right? Looks something like this. Now we want to simulate using numerical models and compare our simulations with the actual data. So we're going to model the magnetic field as this, and we want to constrain these parameters. This parameter is just the average magnetic field at the center of the cluster. This parameter just tells us how quickly the magnetic field falls off as a function of the thermal electron density, how much it depends on the density of electrons. And these are the parameters we used. And yeah, this was the initial simulation that we did. So the blue line is the scatter and the observed rotation measure. The red one is the scatter and the simulated rotation measure. And as you can see, our simulations don't quite capture the complexity of the real one. The primary reason for that is that we don't have enough data points. So that's why we want to sort of expand to more clusters so that we have more data points so that we can do a better simulation and do better comparisons and sort of put better constraints on the parameters of the magnetic field. Okay. So essentially, these are the conclusions that we've had so far. For this particular cluster, most of the sources that we've looked at are background sources. Most of the sources are Faraday simple, not complex. That means that they only have one peak in their Faraday spectrum, right? This I didn't really talk about, so I'm not going to mention that. And the RM scatter profile is flatter than we expected. And we need to analyze more clusters to get a better handle of things. That's essentially it, I think. Okay, yeah, these are extra slides. Okay. Yep. Oh wait, did this mic or am I supposed to give? Okay. Okay.
I can just
Okay.
speak loudly.
Yeah,
That's
sure.
not a problem for me. So you expected that the RM as R, what was it, sigma RM
Mm-hmm.
as R increases would kind of go down.
Yeah.
So first of all, what was the, my question is first of all, I forgot what the R was on the x-axis, and also
R is the radius
the radius of what?
from the center of the cluster.
Oh, from the center of the cluster. I see. Okay, so you can image, right? So you have that contour plot.
Yeah.
You kind of get some measurement of what the magnetic field at like different
Yeah.
parts of the contour plot is, and you see that it doesn't fall off as you move away from it.
Yes.
Okay. And so, and even after you remove what you think are the filaments, right? It still
Yeah.
didn't
Yes.
fall off. So then, why do you think that is like, or like, what are the current ideas of why that might be?
Okay. The current ideas for why that might be. What could that be? Probably, if I was to think about it off the top of my head, is probably there's some kind of shock wave that's going through the cluster that could sort of bunch a lot of plasma together to sort of have a flatter magnetic field. So these magnetic fields are produced by a plasma, right? And if there's a shock in the plasma, the plasma is going to sort of bunch up, and it's the shock, as the shock propagates, it's going to keep bunching up. So maybe that could be it.
Also, I guess in the, can you like just go back to that graph? It seems like you do have like some peaks, ups and downs.
Mm-hmm.
Could that I see, like, so that's as you isn't that kind of because like what I was talking about, like the little, you had like little blobs of contours.
Mm-hmm.
So you just kind of had this thing that looked as if it was emitted in like packets of like
Yeah.
you were saying, but wouldn't that just explain it? Or the fact that the thing
Oh no,
just emitted
that is only for one source. There's a lot of those sources in this cluster. So that image that you're referring to, this one, that's just one radio galaxy. There's like 70 in this entire cluster. So we're looking at all of them. So that scatter profile is for all of them, not a single one. Yep. Yes. Mm-hmm. That's a good question. Yeah, sure. So the question was that we're measuring the change in the polarization angle. How do we know that the polarization angle hasn't changed before the cluster? Okay. So there's two things that could change the polarization angle. Actually, there's only one. If there's another thing behind the cluster. So maybe there's the source that's emitting the light, and there's this cluster over here. Maybe if there's something over here between the cluster and the source, that could change the polarization angle. And we don't know for sure that that's not the case. And yeah, we don't know for sure that that's not the case, but we can make a good hunch that it isn't the case simply based on the Faraday spectra So if that was the case, then we'd see probably 2 peaks. So there's something called Faraday screens as well that cause 2 peaks and depolarization and so on and so forth. But I'm not going to explain all of that. But yeah, that would result in 2 peaks maybe, because one peak you can think of as the rotation measure of this thing between the cluster and the source, and the second peak might be of the cluster. But we think that the biggest contribution is from the cluster. Oh, gravitational. That doesn't matter. That doesn't change the polarization angle. The light would just curve around the black hole, and the polarization properties of the light would be the same. It wouldn't change. Okay?
So you're talking about your method here, and you found that it didn't exactly align with observations, but you think more data points will bring it into line.
Yeah.
Is that something in the literature, like about this method, or something that says that more data?
Mm-hmm.
Or my other thought was going to be like, is that point to test out if it works? But
yeah, that is something that has been done in the literature before. You remember how I was stating that previous studies only have 10 sources per cluster?
Oh, and yeah,
so
right.
the method that these techniques used to make up for that scarcity in data points was to essentially assume that all of the clusters were the same, and they essentially stacked the data points. So they assumed that this cluster over here is roughly the same as this, so they use all of the data points and they put them together in one thing. So we're going to be exploring this as well, but we're just going to do much better because we just have better data. So that's essentially it.
So
Okay.
Thank you everybody for coming out. Another big round of applause for our speaker. Okay, so feel free to grab some cookies and stuff on your way out. Okay. And thank you very much.